Hello and welcome to the Road from Emmaus podcast. I'm Jason Lowe, joined by Andrew Chow, and we are two totally ordinary Catholic guys hoping to share our journeys. Like the disciples on the road to Emmaus, we've each encountered Christ in our lives. Join us as we talk about what comes next. 215. That's the number of Indigenous children whose remains were found on May 29th, 2021. They were found buried on the site of what used to be Kamloops Indian Residential School. Andrew and I take today's episode to lay out what happened, what the residential school system was, and its traumatic effects on the Indigenous peoples, and how the Catholic Church was involved in this dark past. We share our thoughts and talk about how the lay Catholic should receive this news. Let's continue to keep our Indigenous brothers and sisters in our prayers. So, no segue today. Nothing funny, I think, just given the topic that Andrew and I want to spend our podcast episode talking about. You'll be able to tell from the title, probably, but Andrew and I just wanted to spend a full, 30 to 45 minutes talking about what happened 2 to 3 weeks ago when the remains of 215 children were found at the Kamloops Indian Residential School in British Columbia. We had touched on it. We left off our previous podcast episode just kind of, on a quick note, and, keeping them in our prayers and everything. But it was pointed out to us by a listener, so thank you, that it would be good to do an episode on this, just kind of, understanding what was going on, what was the history there, maybe raise awareness in case there is anyone who hasn't actually heard of the issue. And I think, given that we are a Catholic podcast, trying to lay out the Catholic Church's participation in this, and maybe what our response is and what we think the response should be in general. But I mean, before we even dive into that, right? Like, I think it's one of those situations where there's never any words that can do it justice, I think. Obviously, for me at least, when I kind of heard about it, it was like, oh, this seems tragic. This seems a big news story, obviously. But as I read up more on it, I think you could kind of really feel the pain of the Indigenous peoples, right? How much of their history is tied to the residential school system that never should have been implemented, that never should have come into existence. Thinking about, the children, obviously the 215 children, but also all Indigenous children at the time who were ripped away from their families, and then having to go through, again, we'll go into this, but kind of go through the trauma of the residential school system, being forced to assimilate into kind of what was called Euro-Canadian culture, and giving up their own culture for years and years and not seeing their families. I think the pain of these memories has resurfaced, in light of this news, and definitely, as we left off the last episode, just keeping our Indigenous brothers and sisters in our prayers, and in whatever way we can, just letting them know that for what it's worth to them, understanding their history, but God loves them. God loves you if you're an Indigenous listener, and there is a lot here to unpack. There's a lot here to wrestle with, I think. There's no erasing the sins of the past, but only, just continuing to hope to look forward to walk that path of reconciliation. Anything you want to add, Andrew, or?
No, I think, at the end of the day, there's no getting around that there's evil here, right? And it's just, it's one of those things that it's tough to even say that we empathize because we can't, right? The context there, we can learn about it, but we can never learn it, right? So I think, our hearts definitely go out to all those affected, all those who are still dealing with the repercussions of this. But, we don't pretend to be experts on this. We don't pretend like we fully understand the pain. But I think, at the end of the day, we want to say that, we want to offer whatever support we can. And, we just, we recognize the evil that's there. right? And that we know that as humanity, not only as Catholics, but as humanity, the resiliency there is something that's awesome to behold, right? To be able to come out of things that are evil like this and to come out stronger on the other side. So I think that's part of what we're going to be talking about today as well.
Yeah, so just to kind of set an agenda of sorts for today, just to keep things structured, wanted just to raise the awareness of the ugly history that is Canadian residential schools, right? So I'm going to do a bit of a history lesson there, or make an attempt at one. And I think, not just explaining explaining a bit of the residential school system, but also the Catholic Church's involvement, and kind of just a quick idea of what the outcome was, if you're not already aware, in terms of the Indigenous population and the things that they struggle with as a result of the trauma of the residential schools. Going to quickly lay out, over the past 2 weeks, the response from the Catholic Church to this news. So, a few statements from Archdiocese, Pope Francis had a tweet, et cetera, et cetera. And then I think Andrew and I are going to go into, our own personal thoughts on the situation, right? Like how would we respond? Maybe a how should we respond? And kind of just thinking about the Catholic Church's stance, and involvement, and generally how should we approach approach the situation when this kind of scandal is uncovered, or these kinds of things are uncovered, right? So I think those are the main thing. We'll kind of end off with, like, where can you turn to in terms of resources and things like that. So forgive me if we go into a bit of a longer tangent here, or a longer segment. But again, in terms of the history lesson of the residential school system, what was it and why did it exist, right? So as I'm sure we're definitely well aware, back then there were European settlers that came to Canada who kind of came in great amounts of numbers, and they kind of moved their way into Canadian territory. And this was how it went, right? Not just in Canada, but kind of across the world. Everyone was looking for additional land to kind of conquer and to own. That's kind of how the human race works. So the local chiefs I think they were concerned. They saw the situation, and they were concerned about their next generation's ability to survive in this new stranger's world, right? Like, they had already kind of internalized, like I said, they were very much outnumbered. And so their thinking was like, how can our children who live in totally different ways, right? Our culture is totally different from this new, upcoming culture. And truly what I said, it would be a stranger's world for them to grow up in. And so the local chiefs kind of recognized that as settlers came into their lands and started implementing all these new ways. For example, this was something that I kind of found in my research, but just for sport, like, settlers would hunt herds of buffalo and they would just shoot them, like, just for fun. And I mean, that's not anything that's new, right? Like, hunting is something that goes on as a sport even today. And they would just leave mounds of rotting buffalo carcasses, right? In case you weren't aware, if the natives had done this, they would have, first of all, they wouldn't be doing it for sport. They are very much in tune with nature, Mother Earth. And so the only reason they would have, hunted something like a buffalo was for food, was for anything related to living. So they would have made use of every single part of that particular buffalo, down to the bone, to the hide of the buffalo, ultimately just to not be as wasteful is what that outcome would have been. And so you have this stark kind of contrast where, these Euro-Canadian settlers would come in and just hunt buffalo for sport, leave huge mounds of waste. On the other hand, you have the natives who definitely would not have done anything like that. And so that's just an example, again, that I found of how different the culture was. And so, as you can imagine, I'm sure you can understand, the chief's big question was, well, what are we supposed to do there? So what happened was they worked out this provision with this agreement with the Canadian government, where their children would be educated, right? Where their children would be given the skills so that they can grow up and kind of contribute meaningfully to this society that they were going to grow up in, that they would become adults in, and be able to make a living, right? So essentially what it boiled down to was a deal of, you can hardly even call it a deal because, again, I think it was kind of forced on them. But between the government and the indigenous peoples, we're giving you our land, so you educate our children in exchange. I think that's kind of what it boiled down to. So let's get into what the Catholic Church's involvement was, right? So the government made this agreement with the indigenous peoples, but they didn't have the same kinds of resources at the time as kind of the Christian churches did, right? So whether it was the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, Presbyterian, United Church, the Protestants, they were all kind of, excuse me, fairly affluent organizations, I suppose. They definitely had a few more resources that the government thought they would be able to leverage. And so they kind of asked these churches to kind of step in and help them run their residential schools. And kind of the outcome of that was, or almost the goal in some ways, is that the Indigenous were stripped of their culture and they were made to be Euro-Canadian, right? Euro-Canadian like the settlers. The Indigenous were taken away from their families, like we mentioned off the top. And they would be taken away from their families like for years too. It's not something like, when Andrew, you and I went to Western and we were gone for a span of 8 months. These Indigenous kids were taken away from their families for years, and they would be totally out of touch from their tribes, right? They would be totally out of touch from their Indigenous culture. Again, as I outlined earlier, a totally stark kind of culture, totally stark difference compared to the culture of Euro-Canadians. And so it would be a really big lose-lose situation, because if you think about it, the goal was to educate the children in a way such that they could be successful in this up-and-coming society. But what actually happened was they would just go through a lot of trauma and abuse. There were widespread reports of physical abuse, of verbal abuse, sexual abuse. It's well documented by this point. There would be sickness because, the school would be kind of cheap and they wouldn't feed the children enough, right? And so weakened immune systems, et cetera, et cetera. So they got the raw end of the deal on that side. And then when they did return to they got the raw end of the deal on that side. They couldn't even actually be educated well enough, or they weren't taken care of well enough to actually provide or contribute to society. And then on the other hand of things, they were returned to their families again after years, and they would be so out of touch with their tribes and their Indigenous cultures that they couldn't even fit in there, right? So I think it's really important to kind of recognize both sides of the equation there. And it's funny because often when you use that phrase, it's like, oh, here's a pro and here's a con, but no, it's actually just two lose-lose situations. And yeah, just one more note I forgot to mention, but like these kids were forced, they didn't speak English or French, right? And so they were forced to learn in English or French despite not actually speaking that. So again, trying to educate them, but not actually achieving that objective, I think. And so just quickly here, a lot of, again, this is really well documented. It's on Stats Canada, but, high suicidal rates, right? The Indigenous suicidal rate is 3 times higher than those of non-Indigenous peoples. Higher alcoholism rates, 1.5 times. Drug addiction rates, higher smoking rates, which was greater than 3 times over non-Indigenous peoples. So just all of these, I guess, outcomes that is very much connected to, again, the trauma of having to go through residential schools, of having to go through the abuse, right, that they suffered. And of course, yeah, all of those mortality statistics and everything, it's a lot higher. So that's a brief history lesson there. I know I talked a lot there, but Andrew, I don't know if you have anything to add. No,
it's this is a piece that rightfully so is taught also in a lot of elementary schools in Canada. I don't know. I grew up in Vancouver, and I found that Vancouver tends to have a lot of emphasis, or BC has a lot of emphasis on learning about Indigenous Aboriginal culture and learning about these sorts of things. So, even from a young age, just seeing the atrocity that was there with this, it's so far-reaching, right? You talk about both sides of the equation being poor. There's also the fact that they are ripped away from their parents in like formative years, right? formative years where you learn how to love, but you're away from the people who will love you the most on the one hand, and on the other hand, you're with people who are clearly not loving you, right? With all these reports of the abuse. So,
Yeah.
it's really, again, I go back to my statement earlier, right? It's impossible to empathize just because of how far away from a lot of our realities this was, and far away from how reality should be. I think it's something that is definitely a stain in our history.
Thanks for bringing up the part of about the family again, because there was a quote from Cardinal Collins of the Archdiocese of Toronto that I saw in an interview with City News. I think it was a week ago or something. He said, "The heart of who we are is family, and taking these kids away from their families is not right, even if there was a benefit of preaching the gospel." And I think that's really just a good reinforcement of what you reiterated there, because there's no excusing what happened. There's no justice for what happened. It's there's no reason for it. So just in terms of, on the topic of what Cardinal Collins said, there are quite a few kind of responses from quote unquote the Catholic Church. Before we go into that, I want to explain the part about why I said quote unquote the Catholic Church. So I think you'll see in a few interviews, if you were to really dig and look for them, that like there's been a lot of explanations, I suppose, that like there is no actual, it's not like an organization in the sense of, not one person, there's no one spokesperson for the Catholic Church, right? Pope Francis is our Holy Father, and obviously we look to him as our leader. But there is not a PR department in the same sense of like any kind of corporate organization. Instead, the Catholic Church is broken up into a lot of different archdioceses that have their own kind of independence. And so archdioceses and orders, actually, it's good to point that out as well. So just, I guess, keep that in mind. It's a little bit of additional context where, it's difficult for the quote unquote entire Catholic Church to take responsibility, I suppose, or take ownership. But at the same time, and I think Andrew and I will get into this later, at the same time, even if there isn't necessarily a full-on organization, it doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't things that we can do as Catholics to kind of participate in the healing, I think. So just want to, bring some awareness to the responses that have been made over the past 2 or 3 weeks. So the first one that I have is from the Missionary Oblates of Mary Immaculate. And so if you haven't heard of this particular order, this was the specific order that operated the Kamloops Indian Residential School. And so they were very much closely involved in what happened, I think. So just quickly here, I have quite a few, so please bear with me. But the Missionary Oblates were administrators and teachers at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. Through our ongoing reflection and the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we are growing into a deepening awareness of the damage caused to Indigenous peoples, the enduring harm caused by colonization, and the part our religious order played in it through the residential school system. This growing awareness leads us to an increased desire to listen deeply and learn from Indigenous communities where Oblates continue to live and minister. The Oblates remain committed to humbly participating in ongoing efforts towards reconciliation and healing for our role in this painful part of our shared history. Written by Father Ken Thorson. Again, the order that directly operated the school with the explicit apology and kind of owning up to what happened. And, again, we'll get into this later, but just kind of recognizing the sins of the past and trying to work on the healing later. If you want to jump in at any point, Andrew, by the way, just go ahead. Obviously.
On this one, actually, I was going to say, I actually went to, I grew up going to a parish, an oblate parish. And, they are still very active, actually, in Indigenous communities today. Okay. They're probably one of the more active communities in terms of ministering to those communities. The pastor, actually, from my parish when I was young, He actually was transitioned from that parish directly to living in community in one of the reserves and ministering to them. So the Oblates are definitely, this isn't just a tacit statement. It's not just, them saying we're committed to this. Like they actually do very much follow through and are actively there with the community and ministering to them.
Okay, that's good color. So the second one here that I have, I thought it was actually really good. It's a joint statement from the Archdiocese of Edmonton, so through Archbishop Richard Smith, and Chief Willie Littlechild. He is a former Grand Chief of the Confederacy of the Treaty 6 First Nations. So this was a video statement. You can find it easily if you search any of the things I just mentioned, released on June 4th. So just one statement from each of them that I summarized here. Obviously, the actual statement is a lot longer. From Archbishop Smith, I deeply regret Catholic participation in government policies that resulted in children being separated from their families and often suppressed Aboriginal culture and language at the residential schools. This should never have happened to you. From Chief Willie, we wish earnestly to encourage everyone not to allow this news, as terrible as it is, to defeat us. The peoples of our land need reconciliation and peace. Great strides have been made, as Indigenous communities and church representatives have walked together along the path towards healing and the establishment of good relations. We want, and we need, those efforts to continue and expand. So again, I think just it was nice to kind of see them release a joint statement. I think when I came across that, and encouraging, right? Additional evidence that that we are, I guess putting what's the phrase I'm looking for here? Walking the walk, I suppose, of actually working with Indigenous peoples to reconcile. And I know in my research, I found that Archbishop Smith, I think he seemed to be actually quite involved in Indigenous activities as well. So that was nice to see. Okay. All right. So the last one here, obviously the one that probably drew the most eyeballs. Pope Francis released a tweet on the 6th of June. I joined the Canadian bishops and the whole Catholic Church in Canada in expressing my closeness to the Canadian people who have been traumatized by shocking discovery of the remains of 215 children, pupils at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. These difficult times are a strong call for everyone to turn away from the colonial model and walk side by side in dialogue, mutual respect, and recognition of the rights and cultural values of all the daughters and sons of Canada. So that was kind of it, and it was a couple tweets. And so before we go on, like in terms of Twitter, if you're not familiar with the social medium, it can be a cesspool of hate and just terribleness. I guess that's just social media in general, like Facebook and Instagram and whatever. But I was kind of picking through the comments of the tweet, and there were a lot of people who were unhappy with his response. I think I saw a few other interviews where they, there's no explicit apology from Pope Francis there. So I think this is an interesting position to be in, right? If you're a Catholic, and this kind of transitions us into the next section of, how should we respond? How do Andrew and I respond? And on one hand, you kind of have your Holy Father. He's not wrong. What I kind of caveated earlier of, there isn't the Catholic Church as the corporate organization, right? There isn't, that quote unquote typical PR department, although I know there are like PR people and departments at the Vatican, sure, etc. But there is that part of, we are made up of many dioceses and orders, each operating independently. So I understand that part. On the other side of things, it is, he is the leader of the church, and of course, everyone is going to look to him to come out with the apology or with the next steps of how we're going to actually walk that path of healing and reconciliation. And I don't think you can quibble with the fact that there could have been more that could have been said or tweeted or released in a statement. A lot of this is the idea that we are all called to be Christ-like. And this is me talking now, right? We are all called to be Christ-like, and understanding that, just one of us as Catholics, people who are members of the body of the church, people who represent the Catholic Church, other people will look to us in terms of how to act. How do we respond, right? Even if it's just one of us. So as an example, in case I didn't explain that properly, like, I have friends who are not Catholic or who are no longer practicing Catholics. And so in a situation like this, they will look to me to see how I respond to this kind of situation. Because, obviously not that I represent the entirety of the Catholic Church, but in their life, in their context, I'm the person who represents the Catholic Church. And so I think internalizing that, again, we are all called to be Christ-like, each in our individual way, in our individual ways. And, especially Pope Francis, who is the head of the church. I think that's just kind of the thing that I'm kind of wrestling with in terms of what he or how he responded and how I feel like maybe there could have been more.
Yeah, I have a little bit of a different response to how Pope Francis has responded in the way that, and I want to be very specific with how I say this.
Of course.
The way that Pope Francis responds isn't going to make or break my response.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is, at the end of the day, I'm not Catholic because Pope Francis is on earth.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to do or not do things just because Pope Francis says. Will I take it into account? Definitely. Is he our spiritual father and is he our leader? Definitely. But that's not to say that, he gives out marching orders in that same way. And I think that's just another way to say kind of that same deal that you're bringing up, that,
mm-hmm.
It's not this corporate organization where when the CEO says we're heading in this direction, everyone, that's it. That's what you're doing,
Mm-hmm.
And so that's part of what's interesting here, right, is that it's really a gathering of it's a collective of individuals is what the church is, right? And that's where that same thing that you just brought up, your opinion can affect how other people see things. Like, you are an individual who's Catholic regardless of what Pope Francis says, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what you say is valid to you, and that's not necessarily a positive or negative reflection on the church at the end of the day, but that is you living out your faith, right? There's an individuality to this. So that's kind of my first, I guess, initial reaction here is could Pope Francis have said more? Yes, I totally agree he could have, do I know his reasons behind this? Definitely not. I can't even imagine how much there is to balance here between,
for sure.
Looking at, the pressure from the world, as well as probably a lot of pressure from some traditionalists who don't love it when the church apologizes for things necessarily, even if there is obvious evil, and that's not coming from any research. That's just an assumption, but, who knows what powers are at play is my point.
Yeah.
So, would it have been nice if he said more? Definitely. Would it have been nice if he just kind of came out and acknowledged what happened? Definitely. Or did so in a way that more directly says, the church should not have done this, Yeah, totally. But at the same time, for me personally, that isn't necessarily going to affect, what I do day to day or how I approach my faith, because to me, those are different things,
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great tie-in to, again, the theme of our overall podcast. Pope Francis is the head of the church. He is the spiritual father, as you said. But Jesus is the one that we follow in our faith, right?
Yeah.
And generally, this is kind of, I guess we can get into this now. We'll skip that little part for now. But just generally, I think whenever there's a scandal or allegations of abuse or proof of abuse, we need to remember that it's not the priests that we follow, and you and I have said this a few times on the podcast now. So, but it's important to reiterate: it's not the priests that we follow, or the religious sisters, or the orders, or Pope Francis himself. It's always coming back to Jesus. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why we stress the interior relationship so much. We stress the relationship with Jesus so much, and understanding kind of the true dogma of the faith, as opposed to hinging it on fallible people.
Yeah, and fallible is the perfect word for this, right? Because I hate to say this, but like this isn't going to be the last scandal in the church either, right? At the end of the day, people are sinful. There are going to be people with power who sin within the church, without the church, right? So that's something that unfortunately is a reality, and it's a piece where it's never easy to come across. We hear about things here that the church has done, and it's magnified for good reason, right? I don't want to discount that either. Lots of parties were involved in these actions, but we do and we should hold our church to a higher standard.
Yeah.
We're saying that we're following Jesus, and with that comes a level of responsibility that we all ought to follow, that we all fail, that we all fall upon, but that we still hold ourselves to. So, this kind of reaction is warranted for sure, because this was a big example of a time where we did not, live up to our standard of, at the end of the day, promoting love. Like if you boil everything in the Catholic faith in terms of outward action to one thing, everything should be an act of love, and this clearly does not meet that criteria. So we should, say, hey, this wasn't it. We goofed. This was poor. This was a series of poor decisions. There was, who knows what went into it, but there were a lot of people who were involved in this who clearly had deviated from that dogma that you bring up, and done so in a way that was destructive on itself. For all these people that continued to snowball, and did so in ways that were destructive to a lot of people around us, right? Mm-hmm. So are there lessons to be learned here? Absolutely. Even individually, right? To be able to look at this and say, hey, as a Catholic person who maybe I'm not going to be in the same situation as these priests that were put in the situation to be involved with these residential schools or be in the decision-making process. Sure, fine. Let's say I'm not going to be that. All the same, I will become someone most likely who will make big decisions in someone's life. Mm-hmm. My own child's life, actions have consequences. This is a clear indication of, this is a clear example of it. So to take that away for us individually and say, okay, let me really take a look at my own life, and are my sins kind of snowballing and affecting the people around me, causing a poorer life for those around me, Mm-hmm. Let's take a look at that internally, right? Because to me, that's my first takeaway is, hey, this was someone's wrongdoing at some point that probably tipped all of this off.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Someone made a bad call, and other people were in situations to continue that. Which side am I going to be on for that sort of a thing? Who knows when that day is going to come? It was probably a trivial meeting to that person at that point in their life. It could have easily been, or a comment made in passing that affected the mindset of one of the priests that was going to serve in this school. Mm-hmm. Who knows what went into this? This wasn't. I guess what I'm trying to say here is this, equally as I don't want us to look at the Pope Francis's comments and blow it out of proportion to say that this is a failure of the whole church. That's kind of what I'm saying here. Yep. In the same way, the failure that was on the church at that point in time wasn't the Pope giving out marching orders saying, we're going to ruin the lives of these children. Mm-hmm. Let's not get it twisted there. This was a series of poor decisions made by a number of people, right? And they're all, in a lot of ways, ordinary people. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of my big takeaway is that could easily be me. That could easily be me that's a part of that. What am I doing individually? Whether we talk about the Catholicism or not, what am I doing to not be a part of that?
For sure. And I think you're right. It's both things can be true, right? There's nuance here, as there often is with any kind of complicated issue. And there's a balance. And I like that takeaway because that's kind of what is our overall takeaway in terms of it starts with you in terms of the change. I know that's kind of a common thing to respond with and to say, but it's true. I You probably don't know this, but I actually worked a summer before I had a full-time job at the Ontario Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs, now known as Ontario Ministry of Indigenous Affairs. And it was something I kind of lucked into in the sense of like I didn't apply because I was interested in Indigenous affairs. Hand up, that's definitely the truth. I applied because I was looking for a summer job and there was an opening. But at the same time, God willed me into that situation. Must have been because I did gain a lot of appreciation for the Indigenous culture. There was a culture day once, and I was able to kind of witness what being a part of that meant. And I obviously you all know I'm an accountant, so I was just in the office most of the time, just working away on Excel spreadsheets, but kind of just understanding the means, right? Because again, dealing with finances, the lack of means that Indigenous communities were given from the government, that was eye-opening. And so that was definitely something that, has stayed with me, I suppose. And, just in terms of what you can do, right? I'm going to take a minute here, if you don't mind, just to pump my girlfriend's tires, because she's an emerge nurse, and she sees enough horrors there, I suppose, in emerge already. But she decided to go up to Nunavut 3 years ago, and kind of on a whim as well. It wasn't something that she had been planning to do, for a long time or something. It was just, I think she might have wanted some change or whatnot. And she took on a contract. These contracts are usually, I think, 6 to 8 weeks long. Contract up in Nunavut. And hopefully I have this right, but I believe it was in Kugluktuk, Kugluktuk. So not Iqaluit or anything. And there she was able to just kind of witness firsthand, again, the marginalized community, that these Indigenous peoples live in, the lack of means that they have, the lack of resources, the outcomes that I mentioned above, right? From the trauma of having to go through residential schools, leading to struggling with alcoholism and drug addiction, and just a lot of mortality related things, I suppose. She was able to witness that firsthand, and she wrote a few blog posts about it. And so I would actually recommend a couple articles, and I'll leave this in the comments. I'll leave this in the comments, as well as a lot of other different sources that we kind of sourced for this particular episode. But her blog is called This Is Year 25. I made fun of her because she started it the year she was 25 years old, but then she continued it on beyond 25. But anyway, two particular posts. One is named Pups. So this was earlier on. I think it was probably her second contract in 2019. It's a bit... I think it starts with a warning. I don't have it open. But yeah, there's a bit of, I guess, graphic details associated with it. So, just kind of that particular warning. But it is a very good account of what she witnessed while she was up there. And then a second blog post that she has was just before the pandemic hit. So she was up in Nunavut literally, it was March 2020. It was March 2020. And they were all wondering, whether or not COVID would be coming to Nunavut anytime soon. And so that was a really good post as well. And again, just the whole idea of, not just to pump my girlfriend's tires, but she has been her own witness to the Indigenous peoples and to this particularly marginalized community. And there's a way, in some way, I think, for all of us to be a part of that. And another resource is the Our Lady of Guadalupe Circle. So this is actually specifically, an organization, I suppose. It's a Catholic coalition of Indigenous peoples, of Catholic bishops, of lay people, who all kind of work together to, continue to seek truth and reconciliation, right? To erase maybe not erase actually, but to, again, acknowledge the sins of the past, right? Of the ugly evil that, again, you mentioned definitely exists, but to kind of pave the way for how do we get this fixed going forward. Mm-hmm. Anything you want to add in terms of what we can do to be a part of this?
Like I think, I go back to saying little things matter. Like, are you propagating this idea, that which exists in culture today, even, right? Let's not pretend like this issue around the Aboriginals or the Indigenous is yesterday's problem, right? Even today, there is a lot of stigma around the Indigenous peoples in terms of their ability to be a part of society, their functionality, and that sort of a thing. Like, are you continuing that stigma? Little things like that matter. How respectful are you of that when you're raising your children? Do you make an off-color joke?
Yeah.
Seriously, right? Because these are things where at the end of the day, realistically, we're not all going to be joining all of these different these different initiatives, and I don't think we're saying that you need to, right? Definitely explore it, know that it's there, and do what you feel is right. If you have the ability to help it, and if you have the time, and if you have the means to help, do it. We're not saying don't, but at the same time, little things also matter. Don't be a part of this culture that says that makes fun of, I don't know, like alcoholism in Aboriginals. It's a real problem, and it's one that I don't think they're proud of. So we don't need to add to the problem either.
For sure. I did skip over a bit that I think is important for us to kind of increase awareness for. So in terms of the actions that are being taken, in case you didn't hear, there was a statement released June 10th by the Canadian Catholic Conference of Bishops. I think so. Yeah. The Canadian bishops and Indigenous leaders, they're planning to send a delegation of both of those parties to have an audience with Pope Francis. So again, in the statement released June 10th, I'll read through it, an excerpt. In conversation with Indigenous people and communities, both at the local and national levels, and bilaterally with the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit national organizations, the bishops, sponsors of this project, have been preparing for over 2 years now a delegation of Indigenous people to meet with the Holy Father to foster meaningful encounters of dialogue and healing. This pastoral visit will include the participation of a diverse group of elders and knowledge keepers, residential school survivors, and youth from across the country. This event will likewise provide Pope Francis with a unique opportunity to hear directly from Indigenous peoples, express his heartfelt closeness, address the impact of colonization and the implication of the Church in the residential schools, so as to respond to the suffering of Indigenous peoples and the ongoing effects of intergenerational trauma. Again, so that was released by the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops. And so, yeah. So, again, I believe I read that they plan to do that before the end of 2021. Would have done it sooner if not for COVID, apparently. So just encouraging, right? Encouraging to hear that steps are being made, that Pope Francis will be able to hear directly from all parties involved, directly from the Indigenous chiefs and leaders. So it was just nice to hear about that. Before I do the thing where I wrap up, anything you want to add?
No, just that when you brought this up, it was really encouraging for me to know that they've been preparing for this for a while, for over 2 years, right? So it's not, that the church is actually actively doing things about this is really encouraging for me. As much as I say that I don't want to let these things affect my own personal, view on things, like I'm human too, it's encouraging to see that, who knows what triggered that moment, but that, we're not waiting for things like this to happen today to react and say, oh man, we got to throw something together.
It's not it's not just in response to the 215.
Exactly. Which is easily what it could look like if we don't look into things, right? Because if we hear this and then we see, then we're like, oh man, like the church waits until things happen. But, it's encouraging to know that work is being done actively, even behind the scenes.
So, to wrap this up here, I wanted to do something different something I've never done before, and that was just a land acknowledgement. It's something that I've heard before, I guess, as part of, just different events and everything. And I think it's important, I guess, especially in this context, just to acknowledge that we are on territory that is not ours, right? So just really simply, just really straightforward, Andrew and I want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Just to end off this episode here. So thank you for listening. We hope and pray that this particular episode was enlightening, that you were able to take away something from this, not just in the history lesson, but in terms of how we should react as Catholics. And so let's just end this off by asking the one native North American saint to pray for us. So Saint Kateri Tekakwitha, pray for us.